Good day and welcome to my channel. My name is Rhod Mackenzie and today I want to talk about how the EU obviously has decided to destroy all its available gas supplies by alienating its suppliers in the US and Qatar. Now, the EU, having decided to stop its purchases of Russian pipeline gas and now is in danger of losing the LNG supplies of the United States and Qatar, who are among the top 5 LNG suppliers to the European market. This means that the EU is now potentially facing a supply shortfall, which is a consequence of the recent actions taken by the European Commission in Brussels. So what is it all about then? Well, this is about the introduction on something called the Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, which provides for penalties on suppliers who fail to comply with a number of the directives, including those of carbon emission reduction requirements, plus 3 other diversity, equality, inclusion rules. You know, the sort of quotas for the employment of one-legged black lesbian transsexuals with at least 2 disabled children, or at least sponsoring the bombing of Russia and Gaza. Now, the document obliges companies to identify and address harm to human rights and the environment resulting from their activities, their subsidiaries and their partners. So basically they're telling fossil fuel companies that they have to embrace all the green nonsense and all the other equality madness. This initiative is part of the comprehensive programme to achieve net zero emissions and total diversity, equality and inclusion. Now, the directive will incorporate the EU law in July 2026 and implemented from 2027. Should there be a violation of the regulations, a fine of up to 5% of a company's annual turnover will be issued. Now, Qatar, the 4th largest supplier of LNG to Europe, has expressed concerns at the drafting stage that it might be forced to suspend its exports as a result of the European Commission's actions. With a turnover of 100 billion, Qatar Energy would be looking at $5 billion. And I don't think they'll find it worth supplying gas to the EU for that. Now, before I continue, many are watching this video are not subscribers. So if you've enjoyed this video, then hit the subscribe button. Also hit the alert bell so you get notified when I post a new video. Plus, if you want to support me, you can make a donation by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom right hand side of the screen, or by clicking on the Buy Me a Coffee link below in the credits. Now, on Tuesday the 4th of November, I'm going to be doing a live stream, and it will be at 4:45 London time, 12:45 New York time, and 6:45 Central European time. So do join me, ask questions and participate. Now, just this week, the US Energy Secretary Chris Wright and his Qatari counterpart Saad Sharika Al-Kabi have sent a letter to the European Commission and the EU leaders. Now, the letter calls for the abandonment of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is the CSDDD, but the same as the marks they got. The EU is planning to adopt this regulation, which will mean substantial fines for LNG exporters if the environmental violations are identified anywhere in the chain. He said that we're aware of the current formulation of the CSDDD, and it poses a significant risk to the availability and security of critical energy supplies for households and businesses across Europe, as well as an existential threat to future growth, competitiveness and sustainability of the EU's industrial economy. Now, as allies and friends of the EU, we are concerned that the CSDDD will have a negative impact on EU citizens and businesses, leading to higher energy, other commodity prices and reduced investment in trade. Now, the letter's authors also call on the EU to act quickly to either repeal the directive entirely or remove its most economically harmful provisions. This is a pivotal moment when our nations and businesses are aiming not only to sustain but substantially augment dependable LNG supplies to the EU, along with aligning to the European strategic objectives. Now, Qatar's previously made it quite clear it's no intention of complying with the EU's new requirements, and if the EU wants to receive its gas, it better change it. He said, we're not able to supply goods to any countries that threatens to impose a fine equivalent to 5% of our global turnover. So we're issuing this warning because we don't want to halt supplies to Europe, and we're doing everything in our power to stop that happening, Sharida told Reuters. Now let's look at the conflict of interest. As Pavel Maryshev, an analyst and member of the expert council at the Russian Gas Society, explains, companies importing products into the EU must fully apply with the domestic equity social governance standards, the usual bullshit. Now that's an example of how they reduce their carbon footprint, how the energy policies in Qatar and the US are now focused on traditional hydrocarbons rather than the green bollocks. So how do they expect the others to do that? Now the directive in its entirety increases operation and compliance costs, and the fines and the sanctions under the CSDDD could theoretically discourage some sellers and increase contract prices. And you can see why. You've got to do all this bollocks just because you're trying to impress some bureaucrats in Brussels. And bear in mind the market for LNG globally is highly competitive. Now, Washington and Doha have both emphasised that this represents a direct threat to the European economy, and both exporters who have significantly increased their sales to Europe since 2022 are also concerned by other circumstances. I mean, you've got to remember, currently Russia is still the second largest supplier of liquefied natural gas to Europe. And according to the Institute of Energy and Financial Analysis, in 2024, 46% of LNG into Europe were from the United States, 16% from Russia, 11% from Algeria, 10% from Qatar, 5% from Norway, and 4% from Nigeria. Meanwhile, last month, Europe reduced supplies to the US by 18%, Qatar by 30%, Nigeria by 35%, and Algeria by 4%. Meanwhile, purchases of Russia and Norway increased by 12 and 11% respectively. Now, the development of renewable energy sources and policies that limiting gas consumption have actually resulted in a 20% decrease in demand from 2021 to 2024. And Europe is currently developing and expanding its terminals with looking to reduce its reliance on Russia. However, if the increased imports has gone on from Russia since 2022, and Washington and Doha are running out of patience. Now, obviously, this is causing concern to those particular, given the fact that they were anticipating gaining a more significant share of the European gas market. And if they have these kind of measures in place, they're going to not be happy. I mean, the US has already expressed its strong dissatisfaction with Europe's non-compliance with the trade's energy purchase agreements, which commit them to buying $750 billion worth of energy over 3 years. Now, it's a labour-intensive and bloody boring job selecting monitoring suppliers whether they're filling the DEI. So it's far easier for their competitiveness to go to Asian markets, which are price sensitive, and they'll create favourable conditions for Russia, Australia, Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, the replacement of Russian gas was not without issues. I mean, the Qatari energy minister, we mentioned, Al-Kabi, has emphasised that the inability to conduct business in the EU, including the supply of the LNG, will not address their energy deficit. And if they continue with going along with it, they're going to lose their supplies and also lose out on American supplies. I mean, the terms of the agreement is to import overseas energy resources are unlikely to be violated. I mean, it's probable that the exporters themselves will prefer to actually reduce their dealings with the EU. Conversely, the US is in a less advantageous position than the Qatar. I mean, the US terminals on the Gulf Coast of the US are primarily focused towards Europe. That's because they face Europe. However, observers have noted that Doha's response is not merely a display of bravado. I mean, they've got a high level of supply flexibility inherently, which allows them to seamlessly focus on Asia because they're halfway between Asia and Europe. I mean, if the trade tensions escalate, the LNG will go to the Asia-Pacific region, and that will make sure that Europe loses, that it'll be focused on America. And I don't think America's actually going to follow with the DEI directives. So they're going to have to adapt the strategy. I mean, given the EU's plans to phase out Russian energy, it's unlikely it's going to be able to fulfill its plan, because that will just jeopardize its energy security. Meanwhile, the domestic production from the North Sea shelf is declining, with Norwegian supplies having reached their peak a few years ago and continue to fall. plus supplies by pipelines from Algeria and Azerbaijan are not going to be offset the current deficit. So analysts are not ruling out the possibility that exporters will pass on the costs of implementing the directive onto their customers while ignoring most of the content. However, it's not expected to a halt in imports, but Europe's just going to have to swallow its pride and forget its rules of the DEI. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you all again soon. Hopefully see you on Tuesday. Thank you.